Hey everyone, this is the Think Truth Podcast. Elijah and Drew here. We're going to talk about a couple of topics, and they're related to this book by Jinger Duggar Vuolo on Becoming Free Indeed. So, let's jump into the topic here. We are wanting to talk a bit about finding freedom from the legalism of wanting to do everything right to find your security and your salvation security, right? Mm-hmm. So why don't you kick this off? You just had a post on this book where you were talking about some of the things that she wrote about, but we wanted to dig into this thing a little bit more.
Just maybe for a little...
Spilled the water. Okay.
Just for a little refresher on the book and kind of what I was writing about. So Jinger Duggar Vuolo, she was one of the Duggars, and heavily influenced by Bill Gothard, IBLP, and comes to, after she's married, starts this process of what she calls disentangling. It's kind of the Christian version of deconstruction, you might say, because she ends up solid in her faith.
And she's kind of intentional about not using the word deconstruction.
Right. Because this has this kind of Josh Harris, leave the faith connotation now. Yeah. And so she's working through things in her past and thinking, okay, what part of this is good, what part of it isn't, and recognizing a lot of specific ways she would have thought in her growing up years that are unhealthy. And so, the thing today I want to explore, I just want to read a little bit from this book. It's talking about oversensitivity she had as a child. I could relate with some of this. And, I think this is from, let's see, what chapter is this? This is the second chapter in here. This is from the section, Fearing My New Faith. I'm just going to read a little bit of this here. She's talking about progress she made when she was initially became a Christian. But then she says, despite all this progress, I still struggled with fear. The subject changed, but the intensity remained the same. Specifically, I was afraid that I wasn't obeying and honoring God adequately. I constantly wondered if God was displeased with me. I wanted his approval more than anything, but really didn't know what it looked like to have a relationship with him. I wanted to be close to God, but was confused about how exactly to get there. I think a lot of us have been there.
Yeah.
So let me keep reading here. So much of my uncertainty was because I didn't understand God's character. Instead of thinking of him as a kind creator who wanted me to obey him for my own good and his glory, I primarily thought of God as stern and harsh. I had this idea that he would be disappointed, even angry, if I didn't do exactly what he wanted me to do. Even if I didn't know what he wanted from me in a situation, I thought I could get in trouble for making the wrong choice. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Again, very, very relatable. And here's this little story here. For instance, throughout my teenage years, one of my family's favorite pastimes was broom ball, a game similar to hockey that is played on
I don't even know what that is.
an ice rink while wearing shoes, not skates. So, whatever. We would play several times a week. I especially enjoyed the game and looked forward to the time with my family. But after the chat with my mom, I started to fear that God didn't want me to play. I thought he might want me instead to read my Bible, pray, or do something for others, like help my mom around the house. I didn't think there was anything inherently wrong with broom ball. It wasn't a sin for my siblings to play, but I couldn't shake the feeling that broom ball wasn't the best use of my time in God's eyes.
Yeah.
I even began to fear that if I did go play and that wasn't what God wanted me to do, he would punish me by causing my family to get in a car wreck on the way to the ice rink. Oh, that's so awful.
But that's also not entirely, I don't know, I think she talks about it in this book, but that wasn't taken out of a hat.
Right. No, definitely not.
That came from the teachings that she was taught.
Right. Yeah, so I guess I could keep reading here. She talks about this uncertainty came with nearly every invitation to do something enjoyable. If it was fun and I had to decide whether to participate, then I'd second-guess myself thinking I should instead choose a spiritual activity. So I think that gives us a little bit to think about. It's tricky because we want our lives to be focused. We want our lives to be more and more about loving God. And yet there's a balance, because I remember it kind of as a young teenager, kind of having this idea that if I was really sold out for God, I would not have any fun. I would, just pray in a dark room on a kneel in front of a folding chair and pray all day or something.
Yeah.
Like the really spiritual people didn't have any fun. They were always a little too serious and not amazing people to hang out with because you're always going to feel like, snap, I can't have any fun. And of course, some of this, I think, is not just reflective
you
of...
probably went through, at least once in your life, a stage where you actually kind of wanted to be that person, right? In some ways.
In some ways, it was like a love-hate relationship. It's like, this is kind of the spiritual people, but I don't really want to be that.
Yeah.
And I remember very much I went through a phase in my teens where I wanted to be like not the cool guy. I never wanted to be a cool guy because it just wouldn't have worked. But I wanted to be at least someone that was a little less of a fuddy-duddy extreme conservative, but still like have conservative values. That was kind of what
your goal.
Yeah, got me going as a teen. But yeah, I very much dealt with this sense of, not knowing where to put, in her case, playing a fun game. I'm sure you remember, because we would have gone to church together when we would have both been in our early teens. We would play games at church after fellowship meals.
After the meals.
Occasionally there were these bans on playing sports because people should be having spiritual conversation or something.
Yeah, I forgot about that.
Or I remember there was a church picnic where there was a ban on spiking and volleyball. It was partly a strike of being too competitive, but partly this idea of, you shouldn't have... somehow if you're just having fun on a Sunday afternoon, you really should be doing something spiritual, like getting together and... Yeah. But again...
there was a distinct difference between talking to somebody and playing a game with them.
Right.
Spiritually. One's significantly better than the other.
Right. Which is so interesting because I think back to some of my more recent experiences at Cross Keys, being involved in the youth group there, and I very much push them to, guys, let's have good conversation. Let's not just play volleyball the entire Sunday afternoon, which I think is not apologetic about that today. But I think there was something back there specifically where back in my earlier years at Charity, goodness, back 15 years ago or so, where it was almost more viewed as there wasn't a clear idea of what you would be doing if you weren't playing these sports. It was just this idea of, we can't idolize playing too many sports. Sports was just always kind of had this bad sense to it. Yeah. It was prisoners' base. It wasn't like we were playing football.
That was the game. Football? Dude.
Yeah. Football's really sketchy. Just see what happens to most people who play it. No, I'm kidding.
Slippery slope, man.
Right. Exactly. Although they don't have a lot of slopes with football, but anyway. Point being,
but there wasn't anything necessarily that was replacing it. It was just
exactly.
we want to be careful that we're not we want to be safe, essentially, right?
Mm-hmm. And the focus was not on what you would have been doing, but somehow almost this negative way of viewing it. There's certain activities that if I cut this out of my life, if I'm less focused on this, somehow that itself is better. Mm-hmm. Oddly enough, it never was really something like amazing conversation was never really generated as a result of these kind of trying to crack down on too much prisoner's base.
Yeah. It's not like the people who were playing prisoner's base actually had deeper conversations as a result.
Right. Which is, looking back now, goodness, I was 16 when my family left Charity back in the day. So, we're talking for most of this time, I'm 13, 14.
Yeah.
You and I were not having the kind of conversations we are right now back then. Although we certainly had our
we had some interesting ones.
Mainly political. But anyway, not to go down there. But I think it would have been valid for someone to try to see, look, there's some young people here who are spending all their Sunday afternoon playing sports. We should really kind of generate positive conversation. And in fairness, some of that happened back in the day. There was the GFM class.
Yeah.
That was started with the intentional purpose of kind of getting young people thinking about missions, getting them excited and proactive, and that was run by other youth. So there were definitely things like that were happening. So I have many fond memories of those days. In some sense, they still seem like the golden olden days, even though I'm critical of some things from back then. Yeah. Point being, I somehow we need to have an understanding of there being a place for good things like prisoner's base, or in Ginger's case, broom ball, being a case for there being times when there need to be more intentional spiritual activities that we're engaging in, and yet these things not being in contradiction. And I think I often had a bad understanding of that as a young person. So, yeah.
What do you think about the pulling in the legalism word? You know what I mean? When we talk about...
Wait, what does that word mean?
The sense of... like this sense of like wanting to be really careful about everything you do. I think some people maybe call out legalism too quickly.
Oh, absolutely.
In this, well, obviously people do, but I think even in these sorts of cases where people are, it's almost like if you try to do what you think is right, that's automatically legalism. Well, it's not. You might be doing it out of a position of faith. What legalism is, I think, and maybe you can tell me if you agree with this definition or think it's succinct enough, but I think what legalism is allowing doing what's right to give you something that Jesus only should be giving you. So like in this case, I think the sense of security, the sense of like, I'm definitely in, as opposed to out when it comes to being saved or when it comes to being a part of God's kingdom. If you feel like the little things in your life of like this, sports or the specific time that you spend on your phone or what you do or whatever, if you feel like exactly how you spend your time is automatically correlated with how saved you think you are, that's wrong. Even though it may very well be true that God wants you to cut out some phone time or other things like that, but those things are then going to come, let's say, downstream from your sense of security already, salvifically. So it seems to me that what Jinger was experiencing, and I think she says this herself, was this form of legalism where I can feel secure, at least you think you can, but it's sort of elusive because the more things you cut out of your life and the more you try to like litigate between your desires and try to figure out what's good and what's not, the more you try to do that, the less security you have. But I think she would say she experienced this legalism of like really wanting to do everything just right to make sure that she was saved, right?
Right.
Is that fair to put that moniker of legalism on it?
Yeah, it's starting from the position of, often a position of guilt. Like you might hear a message about, how we're not taking our walk with God seriously enough. And then
you're like, oh, maybe I should cut out some.
Yeah. Or like, we need to be prepared for the Lord to return at any time. And, don't want to return when I'm idolizing Prisoner's Base or something. I mean, seriously though.
Yeah.
I mean, those were definitely, so I think you're onto something there, but I think there's also another element there, which is our pursuit of Christ should be seen as a positive thing. So, and in many cases, say I want to set aside a daily time with the Lord and or make longer time to spend with the Lord every morning, which you could turn that into legalism and feel like, I will be saved if I can pray an hour every day. I don't think there's many people doing that though. But I think it's much healthier to start with the idea of I want to be closer to God, so I'm going to pursue God more. And then, okay, you'll make adjustments to your schedule. Maybe you'll spend less time on your phone, so you have more time to pray or read your Bible, meditate, whatever. Very valid. But I think what often happens, and the kind of thing Ginger's talking about here, is you're more starting from the premise of thinking, oh, I'm going to enjoy this activity because why was she targeting the broom ball? Why wasn't she wondering when she was doing the dishes if doing the dishes was keeping her from God?
Yeah. It's only the stuff you enjoy.
Right. These things that you enjoy are somehow going to keep you from God, and then therefore simply cutting that thing is going to put you at a better place.
Yeah.
Which is, I don't really think is usually how it works.
But isn't a part of it too, like let's say you are at a good place, you want to build your relationship with God, you want to know Him more. That slips really quickly into legalism too, doesn't it? When it goes into like this sort of space where you're like, I think perhaps I shouldn't be reading the news just now, like, or maybe like right now, like it still can go into that. Like I think in the next day, I should spend a little less time doing something fun, because I really could be memorizing scripture, or I really could be reading my Bible, or I really like, I'm on the road sometimes. I'm on the road a lot, going to and from jobs in the remodeling job that I do. And I've thought before, embarrassingly recently, maybe I should turn the music off and like turn on some Bible, and sort of that's not a bad thing to think. Like and I do that sometimes intentionally. Although I do it the other way too. Sometimes I'm listening to the Bible for a while and I'm like, that's enough. I need some music. Sure. So I don't think one is necessarily worse than the other, but the idea that there is sort of an absolute standard that you're not quite sure what it is, but if you could get a little closer to like the sort of perfection of like the perfect balance between fun and work, or the perfect, doesn't that sort of slide into that same
it can
space?
Yeah, I absolutely think so. I mean, I think some of it depends on like the motivation.
Yeah.
And so like I listen to music on the road sometimes. I drive a fair amount, but I generally don't listen to music when I'm driving. Partly so it's a time I can think. Sometimes I pray. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I listen to a podcast. But I listen to massive amounts of music. Other times there's no issue, and I'm in no danger of not having enough music in my life. But like that's a personal thing I've done, not because I think I'm going to become closer to God, but just because I'm like, hey, this is a time, if I actually want to think about my day, like when I'm on the road, sometimes it's a good time to do that. If I always just turn music on, then I'll be a little less mentally active in a certain way. I don't think obviously that's not legalism.
Yeah.
Now, if I didn't do that, better watch out, God's going to come get me, then, I mean, these things are so complicated though, because like, okay, if you would actually stop spending any time praying before God and then just think you're good to go, you aren't in that sense. So I think there is a tricky balance with that. Like if you were not making any choices to spend time with God, but then if it turns, so like I think of it like this way, like I take a prayer walk in the morning, and then, sometimes I might be thinking, well, if I was really spiritual, I would take another one. And I think that's where I'm like, okay, like maybe I should take another prayer walk, but not for that reason. You know what I'm saying? Like this is the thing I need to do, and like log my minutes. That's when it's, I don't log my minutes, to be very clear. But like whenever you kind of get into that kind of thing, then that's when I think you are right. It is fair to pull the legalism card.
Yeah. I think the question of is, when I'm making my decisions about how I spend my time or what sort of fun I do, am I doing it to achieve a certain sense of internal safety?
Right.
And if you are, I think that's legalism, because the only correct place to have that sense of like, I am accepted, I'm in, I'm accepted by God, and I'm a part of his family and stuff like that. That sense of like, I'm good actually can be experienced. And it comes only through recognizing that through Christ we have that. Right. Because he took our sin on himself, and it's not our sin that we're dealing with anymore. It's we're not trying to appease God for our sin anymore. That sense of security, like I'm in and there's no question about it, does not come from, well, how many times did I pray today? If I would pray 7 times, would I be a little more secure? And sadly, I think we Anabaptists can slide into that zone quicker, perhaps, than other people who have like the cheap grace. Sure. Cheap grace is a big problem, but absolutely. I think there are a lot of people who have evangelicals who have stuff to teach us when it comes to the gospel.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think the sort of Anabaptist perspective of, well, works are really important is good, but it can slide so fast into, well, and if I would do a few more, I'd be a little more secure in my salvation. And that just needs to be watched out for so carefully.
Yeah. One, I think too often we live at a place where just kind of basic 101 security, peace before God, with those things, maybe it is because of distractions in our life, but like that kind of basic level of our Christianity is missing. And so then it's hard to think hopefully about the rest of our lives.
Yeah.
Where what really should be happening is we have the base where we know we're eternally secure, where we know we're going to heaven, where we know God loves us. And
Eternally secure?
Yeah, don't.
True.
I didn't mean it in the one sense, but you know where I think you know what I mean.
Yeah.
That,
secure in our salvation.
right?
Yep.
That the reason we're praying is because we love God, or because maybe we're working in a situation where we see difficulty happening and we're burdened by it and we want to pray for it. That's where it's coming out of.
Yeah.
And I mean, believe me, I think we all want to grow in that, and we all want to be at a place where we're more inspired to pray, where we're spending more time with God. But it's not because we're trying to cover our bases so to make sure that we're going to get into heaven.
Yeah.
And I think whenever we're getting into heaven because of the grace of God.
Yeah.
We aren't getting to heaven because of how much we prayed, or because I only skipped my quiet time 3 times last year. Even though I think kind of basic Christian living should be a lot of those things. We shouldn't be last week Saturday morning I had time for my quiet time, but we shouldn't be living with those kind of things as kind of a regular struggle. But it's not.
But how you get there
it's
is
not a
something.
salvific. It's not about a salvific thing.
Yeah.
And I think that is, to your point. Yeah, that is where it becomes legalist. If it's I'm going to make sure of my salvation by doing these things. I want to circle back a little bit more to this specific idea of having fun, though, because I think that was a specific example Jinger was talking about, and I think something that I can still deal with it. And I think sometimes it is a fair question. Is my life too much about vacation and fun dates and, making good food and, sitting around reading novels? At a certain point we do need balance in all things.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think, maybe I'll just ask you, how have you come to a point where you can enjoy fun things, that are not directly spiritual in any way, a good date night or just a couple hours alone to read a novel or, something like that? How have you come to a point where you've been able to do that without every time you sit down and do that be like, well, I didn't pray an hour today yet?
So I think some of it was, I got to that place through unhealthy means. Basically, I thought, well, that's stupid to not enjoy life, and so I'm going to enjoy it. And it's a little more complicated than that. But on the other hand, one of the things I think theologically has helped me the most is, of course, John Piper's work.
Absolutely.
Desiring God, and the concept that, to use his words, I believe I'm quoting him, God is most glorified when we're most satisfied in him, which means that when you go around in life and you recognize the beauty of his creation, the beauty of even something that humans have created through the breath he's given us, or when you consider any joy of life, like eating, even like a good nap, or being out in the outdoors, when you enjoy any one of those things, first of all, it is an opportunity to explicitly thank God. And secondly, it's just an opportunity to enjoy something that he's given us. And in our enjoyment, we are glorifying God. And so that sense of in our enjoyment, we are doing what God intended us to do is a revolutionary concept. If you're somebody who's constantly stuck over this question of oh no, I just had so much fun in that game. Something must be wrong. Maybe I don't love God as much. If you're at that place, to hear this message of no, God created a world, like James says, I think it's James, God has given us these gifts richly for us to enjoy. Wow, I botched that verse so bad. He has given all things richly.
Something like that,
yeah. Anyway, I'll have to pull that verse directly up. But that concept of or James, I think, says, God, the Father of lights who gives everything.
That's definitely James, yeah.
If you view the world as this is a God-given world, not an accidental world, not a world that's automatically predisposed to be against God. No, the world in the sense of the secular.
Sure.
But if you see the earth as something that's actually God's, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, you begin to see the enjoyment of it as something actually that in the enjoyment itself, it's glorifying God. And I think that's something that theologically for me, that really helped me to break with this guilt over enjoyment.
I think it helps me too to recognize that we are humans, and God has and God plans for us right now to be living on earth, to be relating with other people. We need to work to make a living. We need to exercise. There's all these things we need to do.
Yeah.
We can't just...
I used to think of those things as like unfortunate aberrations from like a spiritual norm.
Right.
You know?
I don't think so.
Like, shoot, I have to go to work today. That really cuts out some spiritual time I could have had.
Yeah. But I think if we have kind of this full-orbed understanding of, we're humans.
Yeah.
We function well, if we're getting good sleep, if we're getting good exercise, if we're having enjoyable recreational time, we are actually more emotionally and mentally healthy. Mm-hmm. And then you're like, well, I just need to like share the gospel with others. You don't want to hear the gospel from someone who is never having any fun.
Yeah.
And I think, of course, you can take that too far. It doesn't. That doesn't mean you should go watch Netflix 6 hours every day or something.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we should be people who are...
That's such a bad idea, whether you're a Christian or not.
Exactly. But we should be people who are regularly doing things that are enjoyable and refreshing. And I think...
And really enjoying those things as a gift from God.
Right.
Rather than sort of being embarrassed about the fact that we have those things to enjoy.
Like I think about... and it's helpful, I think, for me to see how connected my spiritual well-being is to actually some of those times where I get away. And so just celebrated my first wedding anniversary. And so my wife and I went to Longwood Gardens, spent a few hours there, and then went to an Italian restaurant close by. And it was just an incredibly refreshing day. It was very good for our marriage. It was just felt kind of like freshly in love all over again, all those emotions, and just felt really refreshed about life. I'm going to go into the week after that with a renewed sense of spiritual energy. It's not completely disconnected. It's not like, oh, well, you were just enjoying the day. That absolutely is going to carry over into my enthusiasm getting up the next morning.
Yeah.
To the intensity and ease I feel in praying. Those things are all very
energy you have to give to other people,
right,
including to serve your wife.
Exactly. And so I think it's very helpful to see, if I am actually living a life that's full and rich, I'm going to better be able to relate to those people around me. If I don't take that trip to Longwood Gardens because that's selfish, well, I'm going to have less to give. And I think that's realistically where a lot of these things are. We're living lives where we are emotionally healthy. And of course, there's balance in that. Like there does come a time to simply do hard things and not be thinking, well, I can't,
the fasting, suffering ministry motif.
We can't just be turning down ministry opportunities because I haven't watched a movie today yet or something like that.
Yeah.
And of course, it's also helpful to think about, some things are, if my wife and I would have watched a movie, it would not have been therapeutic in the way going to Longwood Gardens was. And so there's things like that we understand and actually think about in connection to our spiritual life, not because I'm going to get to heaven quicker because I went to Longwood instead of watching a movie. But quicker. That way too.
I don't know.
Right. But because it's not going to make me, what I meant to say, it's not going to make me closer to God because of that. But because make me more, maybe it will actually, in a sense of being healthier and being more able to relate with Him, but not in a salvific sense. It does make
your salvation more secure.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think thinking about those things in that sense helps you recognize, again, to go back to Ginger and the broom ball or whatever game it is you're playing, some of those things are actually really healthy.
Yeah.
It's healthy in relationships. Like you and I podcast, we have intense conversations. We also have times where we laugh and we joke around. We play Settlers of Catan and get mad at each other and do things like that together that kind of, actually make our relationship more meaningful than if we were just always doing this. And I think that's just the way life works. And so, I don't know, it's helped me so much to be able to enjoy those things and realize, these are not at odds with the time I spend with God. They can actually be very vital in helping me be more fully myself and who God wants me to be. Yeah.
So let's try to recap that maybe and just put it in a few sentences. I think one of the main points is enjoy God, love God, and have your loving God be the reason why you sometimes do sacrifices. And stay away from this sort of legalism that says if I sacrifice just a little bit more, I'm going to feel a little bit more secure about my salvation. That does not bring freedom, and it does not bring joy, and it does not, ironically, impact well your relationship with God. And so we need to find a freedom that really enjoys the things that God's given us, while being willing to sacrifice and to minister when we don't feel like it, things like that. And find our sense of safety and satisfaction in the fact that God loves and accepts us. And that's not necessarily always an obvious thing, or not necessarily always easy, but stay away from the legalism that goes for getting all the little, things of your life's activities in order, and especially the legalism that says any sort of enjoyment is off limits, or partially off limits, because we want to be closer to God, or want to be a little more secure
it's really
in our sense of salvation.
God, but
yeah, it is.
God is Grinch, which is terrible. Which is not what God is at all.
Yeah. It's very true. So, I think that's what we have here. Yeah. Let's be focused in our love for God and also enjoy the things that He's given us.